Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Pat Wright, the Executive Director of NJPSA. I want to thank you for joining us this afternoon for this webinar. And as I do on every webinar, I need to thank you for more than joining us today. I need to thank you for everything you're doing out there for the students of New Jersey. Your work is absolutely amazing, and how you've pulled together this new virtual world is just nothing less than a miracle. And we truly appreciate everything that you're doing. Just as something I wanted to mention to you, I'm now serving on the Education Task Force that the Senate Majority has put into place around 3 stages of this. We're looking at this in 3 stages, right? Closing for the remainder of the school year and summer, right? What does that look like for summer instruction or summer programming? And then finally returning to or reopening schools. So in those 3 buckets, it's going to be important for us to get information from you also. We've been striving to give you up to the minute as much information as we can. But we also are going to need information from you as I sit on this task force. And also there'll be working groups within the Department of Education talking about issues. And it's important for us to know what you need, what you think, what guidance you need right away, and try to get that for you. So with that in mind, we've set up some leadership roundtables. I hope you've gotten the invitations. We're keeping them a little smaller so we can have some conversations with members. But they also will be followed up with an opportunity for you to weigh in on the Leadership Connection, our online platform, safe for you to have conversations, ask questions, and learn from colleagues. So I hope that you will continue to use that. Our first sessions will be next week on the Leadership Roundtable, and they're already full about graduation and student recognition and logistics for closing the school year. But the following week, we'll be starting to talk about and have you talk to us about what you need in terms of summer programming as we move forward. And we'll continue to hold these roundtables for many months to come as we know you're all struggling to get things into place, and we want to be there to support you. So with that, I know David has some important, and his team have some important information to share with you this afternoon. I want to thank David for all the work he's doing, Dave Nash, the Director of Legal One, all the work he's doing to try to get timely information to you, the field, as soon as possible. So I hope that you benefit from this webinar and have a great afternoon.
Thank you so much, Pat. It is just a real pleasure to have an opportunity to share information with all of you and to support you in the incredible work that we know that all of you are doing in the field. So our goal is to make sure that you know we're here for you, and we're giving you the very latest information on critical issues as we all struggle through a very difficult time. So thank you all for taking time to be part of our webinar today. And this is part of an ongoing series of webinars that we have been offering, pandemic response webinars. Today, we knew it would be critical as soon as the governor announced that schools would be closed for the remainder of the school year for us to help you in the field as you think through what do we need to do now that we know with certainty that schools will remain closed for the remainder of the school year. So that's our purpose today, is to support you as you think through addressing those issues. We are going to make today's presentation available to you, and just to point out, it is actually available to you as we speak. We have a link to the document in our control panel, so anyone can download the PowerPoint already. We are also going to be sending to everyone who has signed on for today's presentation a recording of the presentation. You'll be getting that tomorrow. You'll also be getting a certificate for having attended this session, and you'll be getting the PowerPoint sent to you as well. So you can download it now as we speak, and you will also be receiving it along with the certificate and the recording tomorrow for our presentation. In putting together today's presentation, we again put together a wonderful team to help you in the field as we're thinking through these issues. Pat Wright, our executive director, has been working incredibly hard to make sure that your voices are heard at every step of the process, whether it's with the legislature, the governor's office, the Department of Education. At every stage, we want to make sure that your concerns are listened to, your recommendations are listened to, and that we're doing everything we can to support you. We also have with us, as we do for virtually all of our webinars, Rebecca Gold. Rebecca is currently the Interim Director of Human Resources for the Hamilton Township School District and has been a great partner with us in developing our Legal One online webinar series, our Affirmative Action Officer training, our Human Resource Director training, and so much of what we're doing on an ongoing basis. So Rebecca, thank you as always for being with us today.
Thank you, Dave. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah. We also have with us today John Worthington. John, we're thrilled to have John. Previously was the director of the Office of Special Education at the New Jersey Department of Education. Prior to that, he was a deputy attorney general. And he comes to us with just a wealth of experience and knowledge. John is going to help as we all think through immediate next steps in supporting our students with disabilities. So thank you, John, as well. For being with us today.
Thank you, Dave. It's good to be here with you.
And we're also happy to have Sue Coyle as we're thinking through how we respond now that we know with certainty that schools are closed for the remainder of the school year. We have to make sure we're taking the immediate steps we need to take to support our students and to address their emotional well-being, to support any mental health concerns that we may be seeing. And there's really no one better to help us think through how we address those issues than Sue Coyle, who is currently the Middlesex County Coordinator for the Traumatic Loss Coalitions for Youth. That's part of Rutgers University Behavioral Health Care. So Sue, thank you as well for being with us today.
Thank you, David. I'm happy to be here and appreciate the opportunity.
Absolutely. So thank you again. We do encourage you to type in questions. We're very happy that we have such a large number of individuals who've signed up for this presentation. So we clearly won't be able to address all of your questions during our webinar today, but we will capture those questions. And we are working to put together frequently asked question documents, and that we'll be sharing on our website. So we still encourage you to type in your questions. We will build in time to answer a few of your questions throughout our presentation, but we encourage all of you to type in your questions, and they will help inform our work moving forward and any FAQs that we do develop. Just to give you a quick overview of our plan, obviously we were spurred on to today's webinar by the governor's announcement. Now that we know for sure schools are closed for the remainder of the school year, we want to just let you know the many opportunities that you have for your voices to be heard, and your voice does matter in this process as we think through what our next steps are going to be. We know that districts must update their plans, their emergency preparedness plans in light of COVID-19, and every district has a directive to do that by May 22nd. Your plan needs to be updated and approved by your Board of Education. So we're going to walk through that. And as we do that, we're going to walk through specific considerations. The idea of a triage approach, thinking through what are our priorities today, tomorrow, next week, next month, planning for the end of the school year, planning for summer, what that may look like, and there may need to be a plan A, B, and C, planning for the reopening of school and what that will look like. And we don't necessarily know it will be a traditional reopening of school. So planning for that is critically important. And we're going to help you think through immediate steps you need to take regarding special education, human resources, as I said, mental health, and some other practical steps for you to consider. So as our executive director, Pat Wright, mentioned, your voice is critical in this process. We are thrilled that Pat is a member of that education task force. We at NJPSA are working very closely with the legislature. We know that every school district in this state will need additional support. as we move forward. And we are doing everything we can to advocate for the additional supports that you're all going to need. But we still need to hear your voices. What are the particular areas of need that you have? So please keep reaching out to us at NJPSA with any suggestions you have, any feedback. We are continuing to do webinars to try to support you in the field, continuing to collaborate with the Department of Education. We have offered a number of webinars in partnership with the department, and we're going to continue to do that. We have our leadership connection. So we encourage all NJPSA members to please participate in that leadership connection. It's a way for us to have an ongoing dialogue with you and with each other as we work towards supporting all of our students and addressing all of the challenges that we have now. And as Pat mentioned, we also have a leadership roundtable that we have begun to allow for a deeper discussion of critical issues. And you should all be looking for information that will be coming out in the coming days about additional roundtable sessions that we are encouraging folks to sign up for. We're also planning for the new normal and what reopening will look like. So we're very excited that we have a partnership with the New Jersey Association of School Administrators. We are going to be offering a Pandemic Response Institute, an in-depth institute this summer on July 8th and 9th. And we do give you in the PowerPoint a registration link for that. And we're going to be providing you at that institute a toolkit to help you think through how we move forward in this new normal. We're also providing now pandemic response in-district consultation and protocol review services, again, with the support of New Jersey Association of School Administrators. So for those who are interested in that personalized in-district service, please reach out to us and we give you Amina Terrell's email address at our office for that outreach. So there are certain steps that we want to think about taking immediately. There is an overarching legal duty that we have as school officials to protect students from foreseeable harm. And we have to think about what that duty looks like now. Some things can't wait until our emergency plans are updated on May 22nd. There are steps we need to be taking as we speak. And we're going to talk about some of those steps to think about between now and May 22nd. We want to think about identifying students who need immediate support, identifying staff members who need immediate support, developing a coordinated outreach plan. And we have to think about our safety net. We have always worked hard in our public schools in New Jersey to have a safety net in place. We want to make sure that our safety net doesn't have any holes. We need to step back a little bit and look at all the supports that we have in place, that we've had in place in our traditional learning environment, and make sure that we're strengthening the safety net where necessary, given our current reality. So it's critical that we take time to consider where those gaps might be. Some areas for immediate support where there is that legal obligation for us to think through foreseeable harm right now, things that we know. Student athletes. It's a very difficult time for student athletes now that we know we will not have spring sports seasons. So we have coaches in all of our schools, we have athletic director, we have counselors and others who should be doing proactive outreach to our student athletes. Obviously, there's lots of constructive things that we can still do to keep our athletes connected with our teams, but we also have to acknowledge the loss of a spring season. And different students are going to handle that very differently. So it's critical that we triage our approach here and that we show that we are reaching out to all of our student athletes. And we have students involved in so many other activities and clubs. And for many of them, they're losing critical opportunities this spring too. So we have to think through what other types of opportunities we can provide for these students to keep them engaged, to support their areas of interest. To support their connection to others. That's such an important part of those ongoing activities. So thinking about those students and proactive outreach is critical. We have students who are graduating, and districts across the state are doing incredible creative things to try to support our students and to provide some form of graduation ceremony for them. And we don't want to just think about high school seniors. We have transitions that are happening from elementary to middle school to high school, preschool to elementary school. We have transitions at all sorts of levels, and we want to honor that. It's important for us to honor that and to make sure that we have some system in place. So part of what we need to do now that we know we're not going to have those traditional transition ceremonies is to make sure that we are offering something. We have students who we know are struggling with mental health issues, disabilities, behavioral issues, and those issues could be exacerbated by the knowledge that we will not be coming back this year. Alternatively, we have some students who perhaps are doing very well with those issues, so we can't assume that we know how every student is going to respond. But we can foresee for some students that we do need to be proactive in our outreach. We have students who are not engaging, despite all of our best efforts to engage with all of our students. We now have a track record since March of some kids who are not engaging at all, perhaps not doing much of their work, not checking in, not engaging when they are involved in work. So we need to think about how we're going to be proactive with those students. And we have other kids who are being flagged because of concerns that their parents are raising, or other staff members are raising, or their friends and peers are raising. So as we think about our triage approach, we have to make sure that now that our safety net fills in any of the holes that we might have had in that safety net, and that we are addressing those populations. So between now and May 22nd, when we must have the plans submitted to the state of New Jersey and updated for our pandemic response, data, right? We have to think about analyzing and using the data we have that we've collected, and in particular data we've collected since the closing of schools on March 18th. Where are the gaps? So there are critical legal implications that we need to think through when we analyze that data. We certainly don't want to find any areas where there is disparate treatment, where somebody is being treated unfairly or not receiving as much support as another student. And we have technology challenges, so we have to work that much harder for students who don't have the same level of access. We also have to think about disparate impact. Even when we're looking at our protocols and they seem fair and even on their face, when we look at the impact that our current protocols are having, they are not equal. We are seeing significant societal disparities that are playing out in our schools as well. And every school has a comprehensive equity plan that indicates that we are committed to closing the gaps that we have, whether it is in services that we offer or other supports or access to key programs. So when we're looking at data, we want to think about a few key issues. Access, engagement, and outcomes, all very important. To what extent do all students have access to virtual instruction that's at a high quality? And we know there are still approximately 90,000 students statewide who do not have the same technology access as other students. What level of engagement do we have from all students? It's not just whether the student can access what we're offering, are they? And do we see disparities based on socioeconomic status, or sometimes we see based on race or ethnicity or gender in the level of engagement that we're seeing among students? What about the outcomes that we're seeing, the kind of work that students are producing? We know how difficult the current environment is, and it's not easy to expect the same level of outcome from students, but where we see large disparities, that should raise a red flag. We should be asking all of our teachers those questions and thinking about what we're doing between now and the end of this school year to make sure that gaps don't continue to grow. And we are seeing statewide trends that can be concerning. There have been major reductions in reporting of suspected child abuse. I would hope that maybe that means that we have that much less child abuse happening in the state of New Jersey. I suspect that there is some underreporting of child abuse that's happening across the state. It's much more difficult to identify the signs when we're not in school. Significant reductions in reporting of harassment, intimidation, and bullying, and that obligation still exists. Suspected substance abuse. And there are at times where we might see students who we think may be under the influence during the period of remote instruction, and we still have legal requirements. Suicidal ideation, or students who may pose a danger to self or others. We are seeing significant reductions in students who are being identified in these areas, and we want to make sure that our safety net is complete and we're not missing those kids. So we give you here a link to the department memo that came out May 5th, letting districts know that your plans have to be updated. We also have lots of other recent memos that came out from the department. So we give you a link in the PowerPoint to all of the Department of Education broadcasts. Remember, your updated response plans are due by May 22nd. So we do have to be working now. We give you a link to the Department of Education checklist. As you update your plans, you have to make sure you're addressing every item in that checklist. It goes through the required elements of a plan. Remember, your Board of Education has to approve the update. That is required under state law. And there are some additional rules that are unique to approved private schools for students with disabilities. So here are some of the key areas that are laid out in the required plan, and we'll walk through each one of those with you. As far as the delivery of remote instruction, we're supposed to be thinking through how we are differentiating instructional time, class assignments, independent work, the way that we're measuring student learning. And that's incredibly difficult when we have everybody with the same level of access to technology, with the same home situation. And we know that's not true. We know the home environment varies incredibly from home to home. And we know access varies significantly. But we have to look at our data on those issues. Our courts, frankly, if there ever is litigation on any of these issues going forward, our courts will be extremely understanding of how difficult this current situation is, but they want you to honestly acknowledge the challenges that you have. And we run into major legal issues when we don't do that, when we don't honestly look at our data and say we're working to address the gaps that we're seeing. This gives you some of the key issues you want to think through when it comes to the delivery of remote instruction. Attendance raises its own set of issues. Of course, we have to think about what it means for a student to be in attendance in this virtual environment, and different districts are handling that differently. And frankly, we often now have to handle that differently depending on the unique home situation for that particular student and their family. But we have to pay attention to that issue. What patterns are we seeing when it comes to student attendance? We have to think through issues of promotion, retention, graduation, discipline, and other decisions that will affect the student. And frankly, in this current environment, traditional discipline oftentimes doesn't make much sense. We're not going to suspend students from virtual instruction, right? We have to think about other meaningful ways to address any sorts of behavioral issues that we're seeing. And that means a greater reliance on things like restorative justice. We want to think about how the district is following up with the family when a student is not participating. That is something that every administrator should be looking at now, looking at the data on students who are not as engaged as others, and what protocols are we following to address that issue. When do we need to contact law enforcement or DCP&P about a potential abuse or neglect or missing child issue? If you have a family that is not responding, you have a student who is not responding, despite all of our best efforts, despite reaching out to emergency contacts, there may come a time where we need to reach out to law enforcement and ask that they do a wellness check to make sure that family is okay. So we want to make sure that no student ever falls through the cracks when we have information and we should have responded. We have recent guidance that just came out, and when I say recent guidance, it's within the last hour or so from the Department of Education. We have a broadcast email that came out today. So we give you a link to that broadcast email regarding English language learners. We do have particular challenges in making sure that we are supporting these students to the same level that we're supporting all other students. So again, we need to step back and look at our data. How effectively are we engaging with these students and their families? And we know that language can be a significant barrier, and we know for many of you, you have dozens and dozens of languages that are being spoken by students and families in your community. So reaching out, working with other districts, reaching out to the Department of Ed when you need help. But we want to show that we're not simply accepting the inability to engage some students or families because of language issues. What we have done to try to support you here is give you some information about best practices. So we had two wonderful sessions that were put together by the NJPSA English Language Learners Committee addressing these issues, and they talk about great best practices that are happening in districts across the state. So we've given you access to the recordings from those two sessions, lots of great tips for how we can continue to have high quality instruction and high levels of support for all students. So I just want to direct you to the fact that we have those resources for you to help you, because it's a difficult area to support students. The delivery of meals is another area where we have to look at our data. We see the tremendous strains that are being put on families across this country now. The number of families that where individuals have lost their jobs. The need for meals is greater than ever. And we want to make sure that everybody who needs that support, who qualifies, is accessing those meals. And we still have a number of districts where there is significant underutilization of the free meals that are available for those families. So now is a good time to look at your data. Look at the data since March 18th. What percentage of families who are eligible for these meals are not accessing them? What efforts have we made to reach out to those families to make sure they know the resources that are here for them? Are we following appropriate protocols when we do have meals that are being provided to families? We need to be extremely careful that we are not in any way endangering our staff members during this process. So we want to look at those protocols. The Department of Education has put out very good information. We have on our website a couple of webinars we did with the department walking through safety protocols regarding meal services. We want to think about our facilities. Districts have to provide an outline of how the building will be maintained through this extended period of closure. And there's some practical questions. How are we addressing student lockers? We do have to have a plan in place to, deal with things like students' belongings that may have been left in those lockers or in desks for younger students. And there could be some health and safety issues here too. Students are sometimes famous for leaving all sorts of food in those lockers, right? So we have to make sure that we're addressing that. We're addressing health and safety issues that could come with things like food being left in lockers for an extended period of time. Making sure that we have safety protocols where we have staff members who are required to, in some cases, clean out lockers. And be very careful if we're going to be asking families in any way to do that. That's not something we want to do without having in place very strict protocols. So at this point in time, we should be having those discussions. How are we going to address that issue between now and May 22nd? We also have to make sure that we are asking tough questions about who the essential personnel are who need to be in school. So we did provide a separate webinar on that issue on March 30th, and it provides some very good guidelines for you about who actually needs to be in school and who does not. What we're learning through this process that we're all going through is that we can do an awful lot of work remotely in many cases out of necessity. And there are very few staff members who physically need to be in that building to do our work. So we give you some guidance on thinking through essential personnel. We have to think through when personnel do have to be in, how are we protecting them when they enter the facilities? How are we controlling that process? Are we able to provide protective equipment? Are we making sure that masks are being worn? What are we doing to limit contact between individuals when they have to be in that building? And now is the time for us to think about how do we adapt existing workspaces and classrooms for the eventual return of staff members first, likely, and then eventually of students into our school environment. What will that look like? Not that we have easy answers to those questions, but we have to think about how we can provide a greater level of safety for everybody as we look to return to the school environment. Your plans have to include summer programming as well. thinking about issues like extended school year. Now, we're going to have a plan A and B and probably C on the summer programming. What will summer programming look like if it is all being done virtually? Which we have to acknowledge there is a significant chance that even this summer we're still going to be in a virtual environment. What will that look like? And planning that out. If there is some opportunity for in-person activities over the summer, what does that look like, and how do we continue to offer that in a safe way? So having those discussions right now is critical. Some unique issues for approved private schools as well. So the Department of Education has provided some specific guidance to approved private schools. As the approved private schools are developing their response plans, they have to communicate with all of their sending districts. You want to work together with all the districts that are sending students to you to make sure that everybody is on the same page as far as how we're going to address student needs and operational issues. So with that, I do want to turn over to Rebecca Gold to talk about some human resource considerations.
Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to talk about some human resource areas. The list is nowhere near finished, but these are just things to think about. Onboarding and how we're going to do a lot of the procedures that we need to do when people are not on site. So for instance, contract signing. How does a contract get signed? If you don't have an electronic documents, DocuSign kind of program, what are we going to do with that? Virtual job fairs, professional development. How do we do new teacher orientation when we don't know the new teachers? You've met them, you've interviewed them, we brought them on board, but it's very different than when you do it with staff that you know. How are we handling substitutes and long-term subs? How do we prepare to know that we have them if we need them, but if we're not in a regular traditional opening, perhaps we don't. Also, how do the substitutes get their certs from the county office? That's been a problem in some areas that we're addressing now. They're addressing, but we have to make sure that everybody knows what's going on with that. Leaves are a big one. Leaves are coming, going, maternity, illness. People are changing leaves now that we're in a virtual environment. We have to be careful of that. We have tips for virtual interviewing. I think that it's very, very important that we look at extra duty positions and stipends. This is the time of year that generally you're posting all your extra duty positions and appointing. But what happens if we don't have summer sports? If we don't have summer going into fall, getting ready for different sports like football? Communicating with staff, tuition reimbursement, contracts signed, I mentioned. Benefits are huge. I don't think you can just hand people the information. They need to be able to speak to your benefits person, and that includes setting up virtual meetings. And of course, pass the trash, employee verification, and all the different things that go on right now in the HR. This is our busiest season, and we now have to address what's going on and how to do these things. Next slide. I just wanted you to reflect on some of the things that are very important. More than ever, if you don't put things in writing, the old adage is then it just didn't happen. So if you are sending out different things that you want people to do or make them aware of things, remember everything goes in writing. There was an old saying where the medium is the message. Make sure everybody can get online and get the information they need. We need to keep up on the information. Mike Calva calls it must-see TV. We need to listen to the governor and the NJDOE information, as well as our Legal One webinars like you're doing today, to make sure that you have everything that you need. Next slide. There was one more slide in there, so let me just go over that one. What I'm suggesting to you is not to start from the beginning. You need to continue your routine HR procedures, and I call it virtualizing them. add on what you need to do to make them virtual. This is not where you're sitting down to decide, how do we start posting and hiring? You know how to do that, but now adjust them to virtualization. Add safeguards to make sure that equity continues. Example, you're interviewing. If everybody doesn't have the same platform to interview on during an interview, that's not very fair or equitable. And I call it the quarantine fatigue antidote. We need to make sure that we take care of our students, our teachers, and ourselves. It's a very difficult time. We can do all this. HR people in general are the most flexible, and so are all of our educators and colleagues. Just make sure we take some time to make sure we're getting what we need so we can help others. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. That's wonderful information. And it is so important that we take time to support ourselves and take care of ourselves in this process. You never want to forget that. It is critical. So with that, let me turn to John Worthington, who will help us think through some special education considerations.
Thank you, David. And hi, everyone. It's good to be with you today. So today I'm going to go over a few legal updates for you, different things, and then I have some things to go over, next steps to take. Like David mentioned, your plans are due the 22nd, so talk a little bit about that, and other things you're going to need to work on going forward, considering the summer, considering the fall issues and the like that you're going to have to address and things you're going to have to think through. First, just wanted to note a couple things. You know the order's in place, the schools are closed. Keep in mind things that I've been looking at, reading. Most, if not all, of our students are probably not going to make the progress they would have if schools were opened. Now that we're doing this virtual instruction, certainly going to be so with regard to our special education students, whether it's IEPs or 504s. So do keep that in mind. You're going to have a lack of progress as well as possibly some regression with the students. So these are things you're going to have to consider when you're providing the instruction supports, determining what to do. And we'll talk a little about comp ed and extended school year services, but do keep this in mind when you're going over this, that you might want to serve more students through an ESY or summer program than maybe you normally did. Now, getting to FAPE, we do know the FAPE standard. It's appropriately ambitious in light of the student circumstances under NDRU. Things are a little bit different now, though. You're going to have some issues. David noted there's still around 90,000 kids with access issues with regard to technology and all. Services are being provided a little different now. You're getting things virtually. Since April, at least, April 1st at the latest, you're probably providing virtual related services as well as virtual instruction and the like. And so the FAPE standard, as far as when we're looking at it going forward, you need to start thinking about this now. How will it be addressed? How will it be analyzed going forward? Are we going to look at FAPE in the context of a pandemic, or is it going to be compared to how you would have served the students if your schools were open? That's going to be an open question that we're going to have to think about. If we go to the next slide, if you look at the U.S. Department of Education guidance with regard to waivers under the CARES Act, the Secretary of Education is allowed to request certain waivers that she deems appropriate. Note that only a couple of waivers were sought by the Secretary, specifically did not seek any waivers with regard to timelines, meetings, FAPE, the provision or the LRE, those types of requirements. Nothing was sought to be waived. So basically, there's no need look at the quoted part. Secretary determined there is no reason that a student's access to FAPE cannot continue online. So they're indicating, at least at a federal level, that perhaps the FAPE standard is not any different while your schools are closed and you're virtually instructing. So that is going to be a factor going forward when we talk about comp services and the like. They're looking at it as having the standard of it's not going to be any different, but we all know things are a little bit different now. We're working, the guidance has told us you're home instructing the students is how we're looking at this. You're virtually providing related services and the like. And generally, we're not not providing as many services as you did when the schools were open. So these will all be factors, but do note with regard to the federal waivers, there were no waivers of the timelines for meetings with regard to initial evals, re-evals, anything like that. No waivers were sought by the Secretary of Education. If we go to the next slide, the one of the significant waiver I think that was sought is the Part C to Part B transition. So the early intervening services, the birth to age 3 students, when they're transitioning to the school age program starting at age 3, a waiver was sought with regard to that area so that there will be a tolling basically of the timelines to finish that initial evaluation. As you can see from the language, districts are going to need to complete the initial evaluation when schools reopen. You can have face-to-face meetings and complete that initial evaluation. One thing I think is important, they authorize explicitly that you can continue Part C services for the students while this process is happening and while it's delayed. And I think that's important. It's something we've been emphasizing at PSA. You want to look into perhaps serving the students, continuing the Part C program if you can provide some services to the students during the gap. Otherwise, you're obviously going to owe compensatory services from the time a student turns age 3 until you can finish that initial evaluation and implement services on the day that you're able to finally do so. So providing those services, I think that's an important part of the waiver. Do keep that in mind. Try to make those arrangements so that you're serving the students, doing all the parts of the initial value you can, and when you're able to, completing that evaluation and determining eligibility, and then serving in your own programs going forward. The problem is we just don't know when you're going to be able to do that going forward. Now, with regard to special education and related services, just noting a couple things. You're aware there's state statute and Board of Education regulations now with regard to permitting virtual instruction and virtual related services. So you can provide the instruction and related services online, at least since April 1st, when the state regulation went into effect. You've been able to do that. So something to consider when you're revising your plans. Your initial plans probably, or may not have at least, included providing related services virtually because the state prior to then didn't allow it. So you may or may not have included it. Something you'll want to consider now. You've been doing it for a while in all likelihood, and so you'll want to revise your plan to provide that you're doing the related services in an online manner going forward. Next slide. Initial evaluations, a couple things to note here. I know under IDEA, of course, there's 2 assessments, a minimum required for an initial evaluation. So it's going to be difficult, if not impossible, we had talked about this in prior webinars, for districts to complete an initial evaluation. You can do a lot of things, interviews, data, compilation and review, things like that. But it's going to be hard to finish an initial evaluation when you can't do the assessment to the students. I'm aware that test producers are working on coming up with online versions. They might eventually be issued and verified through peer review research where you'd be able to complete the assessments for an initial eval using an online or virtual platform to assess students. So that might work going forward, but for the most part, you might not be able to do that yet. So you can complete all the work you can, which that's why I note the Department of Ed in its May 1st guidance is indicating that it expects that you are working on your initial evals and completing what you can. And in the interim, always consider things, the INRS program, tiered supports, consider Section 504, because remember, with Section 504, there are no assessments necessarily required to do an initial evaluation for Section 504. You can be a student with an impairment, a record of an impairment, or regarded as having an impairment. And so it is possible, just like you would do during assessments, where you could create a 504 plan immediately for a student. That's something to consider if you're delaying an initial evaluation. You still can proceed with Section 504. So it might be a way to create that plan, provide the student FAPE under the 504 plan until you're able to complete the initial evaluations. It's something to consider for your planning going forward. Same with reevaluations. Keep in mind, again, the department is expecting that you're doing the work, completing your reevaluations. A difference here, remember, a reeval does not require assessments. Those that don't require an assessment, you could finish those reevaluations. You can waive reevaluations with parent consent. So if that's appropriate for a student, you should be doing that work and completing all that work going forward. And certainly your plans that you're developing should be noting that you're doing the work in that manner. Next slide. Now, with regard to waivers, this is an issue that has come up and it was addressed by the New Jersey Department of Education. Some districts were requiring that parents either sign waivers or consent to the services that they're receiving while schools are closed. The department has made it clear that you cannot require a parent as a condition of serving their students with disabilities during a school closure. You cannot condition it on a waiver of any rights by the parent. They cannot waive their rights under IDEA or state laws and regulations, nor can you ask them to consent to provision of those services in the manner you're doing it while schools are closed. So that is something, if your district was requiring waivers or consent, you should stop doing that going forward. I would not include that as part of the plan. That is not something you're permitted to do. You serve the students as best as you can during the closure, but you should not consider or condition any provision of services on obtaining waivers or consent from the parents. Next slide. Now, compensatory services, a couple points on this. We had gone over it in an earlier webinar. This is something that you need to be thinking about now and going forward. At some point when the schools fully reopen, the issue is going to come up of what compensatory services, or if any, is a student entitled to based on how they progressed, if they did progress during the time that schools were closed. So it is going to be an issue. There's a lot to be figured out with regard to this. What was FAPE while schools were closed? What constitutes that? Are you looking at it in the context of a closure? Are you going to compare it to what they would have received if schools were open? That's going to make a big difference on any compensatory services, how you analyze that issue. That will be something certainly that'll be addressed by the U.S. Department of Education, State Department, and ultimately, as David noted, there could be some litigation, and so courts will look at it. I think there will be a certain amount of flexibilities, but you do want to be considering these issues now. It's not going to necessarily be one-to-one. That's not typically how you look at compensatory services. Every hour of instruction missed doesn't necessarily have to be made up. Every hour of related service, not necessarily, but you want to look at, we have several factors here for you to look at. You know, one important one, the disproportionate impact on the student as compared to other students. I think that's going to be a key consideration when you're looking at it, is how was that student impacted as compared to all students? Because I think it's clear all students are being impacted by the closure. So you will want to examine that and other factors that we've listed here. And it's something you have to be prepared for. The better you're serving now, more that you do, then maybe the less likely or less compensatory services you'll have to provide going forward. But you really do need to be thinking through these issues and be prepared to address these services when schools do reopen. And now just some, next slide, yes. Some couple things to go over. David had talked about the plans that you need to submit, just highlighting a couple of areas with regard to special education. You know, you're gonna have to be talking about instructional time. And I think key language is maximizing student growth and learning to the greatest extent possible. The department uses that phrase throughout the guidance, this May 5th guidance and other guidance. I think that's key. The standard, New Jersey is looking at it. They know perhaps you're not going to be able to do things as well as it occurred when schools were in session, but you do have to work when you're developing these plans to do things, whether it's the instruction, whatever you're detailing, you have to be able to serve the students with disabilities to the greatest extent possible is what you want to look at. If we go to the next slide. And so, thank you. Oh, wait, yep, one slide back. Yeah, I'm sorry. So again, describing the delivery of the services and all, David had talked about that. You want to provide a lot of detail. How are you going to be implementing the IEPs for students? How are you implementing 504 plans, describing the methods? I think documenting, taking data, this is all going to be very important. You need to document the services you're providing now in case any discussions that come up going forward, you're going to want to be able to show all the services that were provided for a variety of reasons. You need to document them for semi-program purposes. There's a lot of reasons you want to carefully document the services you're giving, the determinations you make with regard to this, providing the services. Again, notice the third bullet, describe how you're having IEP meetings, conducting evaluations evaluations, reevaluations. The department is making it clear that they believe and they expect that you are conducting all the work that you're required to do. Even though schools are operating virtually, they expect that you'll be doing that work to the greatest extent possible while the schools are closed and you're operating in this virtual environment. I know a lot of districts, you're having your IEP meetings now. It is basically what's considered IEP season. And so you need to continue that work, hold the meetings with the parents, be developing things going forward. I think the last part is key here. Outline for how you're going to provide summer services. You really want to think through the summer and the ESY program. I would look at this in this regard. I would consider perhaps serving more kids than you normally served with ESY programs in the past because of the lack of the same progress students would have made when schools are open. You might want to think through and be a little more expansive with regard to your ESY programs, in addition to trying to figure out how you're going to provide those services, because that's another consideration, is how will you be doing it? I don't know whether you'll be able to do it in person or whether it'll remain virtual over the summer. You need to plan for that now, not only who will receive the ESY programs and should more students receive them, how are you going to do that if it's a virtual program as opposed to in person, if there's some sort of hybrid. It's something that you're going to want to look at going forward, and now you really need to be planning immediately. Rebecca had noted personnel issues and all. You have to figure out what staff you're going to utilize if you decide to expand the programs going into summer. If you're serving more kids, what staff can you utilize for that? Is that going to require additional contracting or payments to do it? Are you going to use clinics and agencies? So think through these issues when you're developing the plans. I know they're due the 22nd, but it will be critical to think through it now. Some other things just to look at now, maintaining data. I think that's like the key thing to stress. You really need to provide and compile all the data you can on the instruction you're providing, services, supports, and the like. You want to be able to document what's happening. You should be working with parents going forward. You're having your annual review meetings now. Keep in touch with the parents, work with the parents, make sure any issues are being brought up so that you can consider them. I know in number 4, the ESY, you might want to consider expanding, like I had noted, providing that to more students. And note, in a press release on May 4th from the governor's office, they talked about creating a steering committee. That's going to be important. They're going to try to provide some guidance on these summer programs. So make sure you're looking at that to assist you in how you can serve students, who you should serve. That'll be important to look at going forward. Number 5, same thing on a more global scale. I had already talked about this, compensatory services and like how you're going to provide them, what are you going to do? I think providing some things over the summer could help, but you're going to need to start planning. And this is perhaps after your plan goes in, but you got to start thinking through when schools reopen, how am I going to provide compensatory services? How much is appropriate for students? What might be too much? What staff am I going to utilize? Because again, if you go to one-to-one, are you really going to be able to make up every hour of instruction or a related service? Perhaps not. Perhaps that would be too many services for any student to receive, but you want to start planning for this now so that when schools reopen and you're considering these issues in IEP meetings or otherwise, that you're prepared to consider those issues. Other things to consider, how are you using your teachers now? Make sure you're planning for that in your plan you're submitting and going forward, being that you're instructing virtually. Say you have a team co-teaching situation. Maybe you have the co-teacher working separately in breakouts on Zoom meetings and the like. You can do breakout sessions. So thinking about best ways to utilize your teachers, utilize your paraprofessionals to help the teachers, support them in their work with the students. Make sure you're thinking through basically ways to maximize the use of your staff. You want to be thinking of that now for going forward. Number 8, developing your IEP's 504 plans. Like I noted, it's IEP season where the majority of them happen to be reviewed now. The annual reviews are coming up. You have to consider the impact of the closure on the students when you're developing the new IEPs. You might even, you're going to need to think through what might schools look like going forward and how should I be writing the IEP? What if it's virtual instruction again in the falls and the school can't open? What if it's a hybrid where it's partially in person, partially virtual instruction? You'll want to think that through when you're developing the IEPs. The ones you're working with now were probably developed last year. Now you're developing IEPs for the fall, but you're not really going to be sure whether schools are actually opening. So you're going to have a lot of things to think through, and you may want to address that in the IEPs. If we're going virtual, this is how we're going to do it. If the school's open, this is the program and services. It's just something to keep in mind when you're having all these annual review IEP meetings. Next slide. And so now, one thing I think you really need to be planning now. I was in a meeting with a board of directors yesterday. Something you got to really think through is, what are you going to do in the fall with regard to your IEP 504 students and the plans? Are your schools going to be virtual? Are they going to be full in person? Is it going to be a hybrid? A lot of directors said they're planning for all three contingencies, and that's something I think you have to look at. How are you going to plan? What are you going to do? You have to be prepared for all the contingencies on how you might instruct students, even thinking through whether if school's open, perhaps they'll have to close again. So all types of issues that you have to consider and start planning now for how you'll serve your students with disabilities when the schools open in whatever form they might open in the fall. And think too, if you open the schools, you got to think through issues. How are the changes going to affect students with the disabilities? Directors talk about, a lot of students might not wear the masks. They might not want to work with a staff member wearing a mask. How are you going to acclimate them to that? If social distancing requirements are in place and they need to follow them, how are you going to work with certain students to get them to follow those requirements? So keep that kind of thing in mind. Discipline, I know David had mentioned that during the closure, but those are issues too. Even when you reopen, are you going to discipline a student that refuses to wear a mask if it's the disabling condition that causes them to be unable to wear the mask? It might be because this will probably be a disciplinary offense going forward if you open schools and say we have social distancing requirements and you're going to be disciplined if you don't follow them. You'll have to think through those issues with your students with disabilities. How do you deal with those issues going forward? It's just a lot of planning you're needing to do along with creating your plans for the 22nd. There's so many issues you got to think through. And again, don't know yet whether your schools will actually open or not. So you have to do a lot of different types of planning in order to be prepared for when the schools do actually open. Thank you.
Thanks so much, John. Part of what we're trying to help you do with this particular webinar is to help frame the issues for you, help you think through the issues that have to be addressed, help you address some of the important legal considerations and best practice considerations that come into play. And of course, as we're thinking about the next steps, we always have to make sure that we're doing everything possible to support all of our students, keep them safe. And a critical part of that is thinking through mental health considerations as we support our students. So now I'd like to turn the presentation over to Sue Coyle to talk about some of those critical issues. Sue, are you able to join us? As we're waiting for Sue to join us, Rebecca, do you want to see if we have questions from folks that we might want to address?
I'm here. I lost my screen went dead on me for a minute, David. I apologize. I'm back.
All right. So let's do that, and we'll continue with Sue, and then we'll move on to questions. Go ahead.
Okay, thanks. So the goals for this segment are to just help you develop your thinking and a solid checklist of key actions of what you need to do to ensure student supports are in place, like right now at this point in the school year, and then by the end of the school year as well, given the fact that we know now that school is not going to be in real-time session. And also help administrators identify resources for doing that and for supporting students and helping educational support professionals as well, and consider how to provide access to resources and supports for students and parents beyond the school year. So So the key areas that we'll be looking at would be addressing the losses of milestones, as David referenced earlier on in the webinar. Those transition rituals, in lack of in-person goodbyes and those things. And then also we'll be looking at individual student supports. And then another key area in my work with my graduate students at Kane and with at Rutgers with the Traumatic Loss Coalition in my county, educators are coming to me with a lot of questions and looking for guidance and support on how to help parents and families that are experiencing loss, those due to COVID-19, as well as just the normal course of losses that are happening now that happen in normal course of life. And then finally, protocols for addressing when school communities are impacted by the loss of a member of someone in the school community as well. So, so when we talk about losses in general, that David had referenced earlier, graduation is an obvious one. But now's the time to identify all of those little milestones and traditions to ensure that no one group is overlooked in their needs for having those addressed. At a time when we've lost control over so many things, allowing stakeholders to have input if possible can help offset the feelings of loss over those important milestones. And it can also help foster a sense of connectedness to the school community. So communicating with stakeholders such as coaches, club advisors, leaders of student organizations, and even parent organizations, if it's possible, to determine how to provide for virtual versions of those kinds of celebrations and ceremonies is important. And another important consideration as you plan for these is to consider and find ways to incorporate promoting themes of resilience. This is such a great opportunity to seize a teachable moment by modeling how adults in the school community address problems and find creative solutions. So at the end of this segment, I've provided you with a compendium of resources and something called a Padlet with many ideas about how to do those types of celebrations and traditions. So I'll be sharing that with you at the end. So one caveat is that as I talk about some of these examples, such as drive-in graduations and virtual graduations in a variety of different forms and parades, it's important to make sure that that those are all things that are deemed safe by local health officials. So there's many examples that will be in the resources that I provide you. And then this year, more than ever, it's important to encourage teachers to plan solid end of the year closure activities. And also now is a time to begin to adapt transition practices. So how will articulation meetings occur from elementary to middle to high school? Because that's going to help kids with knowing how the school year ends, as well as it's going to be providing for good practices that are going to help whether transitioning back to regular school or however school is going to look in the fall. Also now, how you plan for, how you will continue other types of traditions around transitioning is important. I know my kids always look forward to a tradition on the last day of the school year where their teacher introduced them to their new teacher for the upcoming year. They would have been disappointed had that not gone on. So thinking about what are the things that are normally having and finding ways to maintain those traditions to the greatest extent possible can help contribute to overall mental health. And also it's always with an eye on helping maintain that those connections in the school community. So we can move on to the next one, David. So also a key area is making sure that we're providing a plan for supporting students with pre-existing mental health conditions, and also those that may have emerged during this time of the pandemic. So right now, it's crucial to survey staff to get updated information on how students with mental health issues are functioning. And in addition to students who you're currently monitoring and providing support for, now's the time to ask teachers to report any new and emergent concerns that they may have that they've identified even during the distance learning. So this will provide you with time to assess student needs, connect with parents and students themselves, make necessary referrals. So plans for support can be put in place by the end of the school year for these students. Also having targeted conversations with parents and students to learn how their mental health issues have been impacted and how they're coping or not under the new circumstances. So gathering information now will make it possible to have a firm plan for support by the time school ends and we go into summer break. And now is also a crucial time to connect and coordinate with parents and students and the mental health providers to facilitate a warm handoff for support to new and or existing referrals to ensure that students continue to benefit from necessary mental health services. And then very important is creating or updating student safety plans. Work with students to identify coping strategies that have worked for them in the past and identify areas that they anticipate will present challenges during the summer. Providing safety plans and working with students around them is something that we found to be very beneficial when we had students coming back from hospitalizations or after a suicide attempt. Now more than ever, it's really crucial. This is an effective way to help students learn to cope ahead so that in time of crisis, when their ability to think rationally might be compromised, they can go to their safety plan that will remind them of the tried and true coping skills, their support persons, contacts, and hotline numbers. And finally, by the last day of school, ensure that students have a written or digital plan like that and have shared it with trusted adults, have had an opportunity to practice it with you virtually. And you see on the side here, this is a sample plan of a safety app that, that we've used successfully, but it can either be a digital app like this or something in writing. So that it's a concrete thing that students can refer to, and it's been updated for what their needs are going to look like in the summer. Okay, David. So another area to make sure that you're providing support going into the summer would be for LGBTQ students. This resource down at the bottom of the page here is a link to a great tip sheet that was created by the Human Rights Campaign. That is a great resource for counselors and gives ideas for how to provide supports, but also connect students to supports that they can access virtually over the summer, especially during a time when they're already feeling disconnected and alienated. So this providing them with opportunities to find ways to support, connect with other kids and adults around the issues that concern them is important. Thank you, David. You can move on. So David and I don't know why, but this got a little wonky here on this slide. Just letting you know, and I'll be highlighting them in the resource tool that I've created for you at the end, but these are various different apps for various different age groups of kids that speak to ways to, provide coping skills and virtual hope and mindfulness activities. So providing for all students as well as the kids that you have the concerns with mental health issues. These kind of tools can be something you can leave them with over the summer. So another important area is suicide risk assessments, and if this hasn't happened already, it's important to be in this virtual setting, reviewing and adjusting your assessment protocols along with your ed specialists and your crisis team and your administration, and having clear written process, with templates and checklists for how this is going to happen in this virtual setting is so important. There's a link down to the right of your screen that brings you to an excellent tool, the Comprehensive School Suicide Prevention and Time of Distance Learning, and it links you to other wonderful checklists for ways to handle this in this setting. Another important piece about this to make sure that you're informing staff and keeping it in the forefront of their minds. At this time, as school year's ending, is something we've typically seen is that kids that are already struggling with depression or other mental health issues tend to sometimes escalate. Or it could sometimes the impending change, especially on top of all the change that kids have been dealing with, could cause an uptick in what we're seeing with regard to suicidal ideation and behavior. So you want to be making sure that it's key in the mind of staff to be thinking about the kids that and watching out for any signs of that now, and making sure that they know what to do with that information now and during the summer, especially since at some point, and I've had this happen when I was working in K-12 districts, oftentimes something would happen in the summer, a kid would somehow reach out or information would come to a staff member via some kind of social media, and it's important for staff just to know what to do if something does come to their attention, and who would be the administration and how they would flag that and make sure that students were being assessed and taken care of. And then finally, reaching out to your local crisis center or emergency room. Hopefully it's not an emergency room, but if that's what's used as your local crisis center for suicide assessments, making sure you're connecting with them, having a conversation and finding out what their current operations look like now during this time. And so that then you can be informing parents of how to access those, especially the parents that you know already have students that are struggling. And then also making sure that you're putting something up on your website that directs parents of what to do in the event that they feel that their child is experiencing a mental health crisis. Okay. And providing support for parents, just thinking about what they're going to be needing over the summer and considering them across all the tiers. What are the parenting tips and resources that you can leave parents with for the end of the summer going in, especially since many things like vacation plans and things are going to be canceled, and parents are going to be looking for new ways to handle things with their students. And then also considering special needs students and students with mental health concerns. So providing information this month and making parents aware of it, and then making sure that you've got lots of resources up on the website and that parents are aware of those in case something occurs in the summer and they have a go-to place to get information. And publicize it in lots of ways, and making sure it's in multiple languages. And then just be aware that I've been having conversations with folks with DCP&P and around and how Perform Care mobile response is still up and running. They have virtual protocols. I understand that there are even some things happening where there's some in-home providers that are still doing in-home services for families. So encouraging you to, when you have concerns about families or either new or ongoing, make sure that those connections are happening for them. You're connecting families to Perform Care services that can be continuing through the summer. Families that have experienced difficulties in the past are aware of mobile response and those kind of things. So, providing support if a death impacts your school is an important thing to have in place. So reviewing and adapting your protocols now for how, if it, my hope is that it has not occurred for any of you at this point, but I know around the state that there have been districts that have been dealing with some losses and struggling with how to adapt their protocols, their crisis protocols around that. So reviewing what what you have done in the past and how do you adapt that to a virtual setting. Like how and who will be notified, determine who, the most basic things are that, determining who may need support, having some resources on hand for parents, and I'll be talking about those in a minute, and then consulting with us, the Traumatic Loss Coalition. So let me explain how, for those of you that aren't familiar with us, the Traumatic Loss Coalition is a statewide organization. We have a county coordinator in every county that works with a coalition of educators and mental health professionals and other interested community folks that serve kids. We do training in suicide prevention and trauma understanding, and we all have trained volunteer crisis responders that go into schools and have for almost 20 years now to provide assistance to schools when there's been a severe loss in the community that impacts many in the school community. So we have adapted our protocols, and in the event of a loss, we can still assist administration and crisis team leaders in assessing what the needs are, given whatever the loss is, and helping develop a plan for support. We'll provide assistance with drafting notifications and communications, provide support to and resources for students and parents, and we have many trained people in the schools now who understand how to use psychological first aid. So we've adapted that to a virtual setting. So we will send in our trained traumatic loss folks to partner with your inside counseling staff to provide virtual psychological first aid to students and staff. I think you just skipped a piece. Oh, just one last piece about that is that I wanted to make sure that, we would make sure that we would have lead crisis responders co-facilitate PFA with school personnel. And we would work through whatever your school's platform is for communication. Okay, David. And then lastly, resources for families after a loss is a key thing to have information on hand, so that, and that's been the greatest need that I have seen in the last 2 months. So I want to let you know about two really wonderful organizations that you can direct families to when they have experience a loss. One is called Good Grief, and they provide virtual support groups for families that have experienced losses, whether it's to COVID-19 or other reasons. They've also been providing excellent webinars and podcasts for parents and educators. And another thing that is an unfortunate need we have now is helping families with information and pointing them in the direction of how to manage funerals in a time of pandemic. And Good Grief has created a really wonderful toolkit for children and families about how to do that. And then another organization is that provides free grief counseling virtually is called Imagine, a Center for Coping. And both of those are links that you can click on and get more information. So finally, I've mentioned that, talked about a lot of things you should be doing, but I wanted to also provide you with some really excellent, solid resources to guide you through that process. So David's going to click on that and I can show you. I was searching for a way to help my coalition members across Middlesex County. Over 2 months, I was sending them so many resources about coping with this pandemic, and people were getting overwhelmed. And so I searched for and found a great way to organize those resources. So please note these are columns with the various different, yep, David's showing you how you can scroll down, and each one of these things will take you to a document or a website with excellent resources. Some of them I mentioned here today, but then others that I know will help you in your planning for taking care of the mental health of students. So that's not my piece, but I just want to let you know, hang in there. I wanted to give you a nice New Jersey theme to end my piece on, because I talk about all this sad stuff.
Yes, there are incredible resources. I know we only had a second or two to show you, but I encourage everyone to take some time to look at that. Sue has taken a great deal of time to put in one place lots of great resources to support your students and families and yourselves. So thank you so much for that. I know we are a little bit over our time, but I do want to open it up just for a question or two, Rebecca, if you would like.
Yes. We had a question about addressing the movement of students out of their home district because parents are essential workers. They've
So
sent the student to a relative in another state.
So the family has temporarily gone somewhere else so that the children stay safe. You know, in this extraordinary circumstance, the school district should continue to provide those services. The intent of the statute on residency was not to say that in a circumstance like this, we discontinue services when you've got what I think would be intended to be a temporary removal for safety purposes. So I would suggest, of course, you're going to talk to your board attorney, but I would suggest you err on the side of continuing the services, even though that student might physically be somewhere else.
Right. And we have something else. This is for John. Has the state approved any products for child study team to complete evaluations virtually?
Not that I'm aware of. I check the DOE website regularly. I see nothing. I have not seen anything yet that's approved. And I don't know if the state will necessarily endorse or approve a product. I would maybe look instead for the producers of some of these products, such as the whisk or whatever the test might be. Take a look and see if they've created a version that can be administered virtually that's been validated. You might want to check their websites from the providers that you're obtaining the tests and the programs from. That might be a better way to look for that. And then you're going to have to use your professional judgment, you and your teams and the like, with regard to whether it's going to be an appropriate assessment of the student for purposes of that evaluation when you do administer it, if you do it that way.
Okay. Do you want one more?
One more, and then we'll close up.
We have some students that are not engaging despite repeated attempts by the staff. They even had the SRO call the homes. What else can they possibly do?
So you might want to think about who is the staff member or staff members who have the strongest connection with that student. It's not always an administrator, it's not always a counselor, could be a lot of different folks in that building, and trying to employ some of those individuals for outreach. Sometimes the student hears a voice that they have connected with in that school, and that can make all the difference in the world, or a parent hears that voice. So I think getting creative about who is doing some of the outreach could be very important. Making sure you've worked through all the emergency contacts if folks aren't responding. And in that worst case scenario where there's no response at all, getting to law enforcement to do a wellness check is very important.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Dave.
Absolutely. So I wanted to point out as we're wrapping up today, some of the other resources that are available to you. We are going to be doing another free webinar tomorrow on addressing the needs of homeless students. So we're going to have some great information and resources. We can imagine the additional challenges that come with being homeless as we're dealing with this pandemic. We give you a link here to other upcoming free sessions that we're offering and some recent sessions that we offered as well. I want to remind you again that we are planning an in-depth 2-day summer institute in partnership with the New Jersey Association of School Administrators to help you and to provide all of you with a toolkit for planning for our new normal and what school will look like moving forward. These are links to some of the pandemic response webinars that we have already provided for you. Some great resources in each of these that could be helpful to you moving forward. And you see all those particular sessions. We are still providing ongoing professional development. We have adapted our planned professional development to our remote environment. So we have some examples here of upcoming sessions through the end of June that we are going to be offering remotely. And of course, we had already planned before any of this a series of webinars that we're offering throughout the year to try to support all of you remotely. So with that, I do want to thank everybody for taking the time. I know how busy all of your schedules are. I want to thank all of our incredible presenters for sharing your wisdom and resources with all of us today. And remember, we are here at NJPSA, FEA, of course, with Legal One. We are here to support you as you move forward, and anything we can do to help you, we will. Thank you all for participating, and we will be providing additional webinars as we move forward to continue to be your partners in doing everything we can to support our students. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you all. Goodbye.
Take care, everyone.